All right, that's fine, no worries. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Political Science 303 once again. I think Tuesdays are better because we start at 10:30 instead of Fridays, which starts at 9-ish. Okay, so you look more awake this morning. Some of you have other exams, I know, but they still showed up. Thank you for coming. Okay, where did we leave off? Last time, ladies and gentlemen, we were discussing, I think we started off with political economy of economic and social policies. I'd like to complete my discussion there and then start off with a new part on governance and policy making. Okay? But any questions from last time? Any questions, anything that concerns you, anything that looked weird while you're working at home on it or about it? Everything looks crystal clear. That's surprising. Okay, we'll see. All right. Thatcherism. This was the last bit we were discussing. Consensus era, increased state responsibility, massive government intervention into the economy, fine-tuning, Keynesian demand management, taming the business cycle through the hands of the state, and the Keynesian welfare state, which we briefly talked about last time, with different programs. And then, this was happening post-World War II for about 25, 30 years, 1945 till about the early 1970s. What happens in the early 1970s? 72, 73, first crisis, OPEC, oil-induced crisis, unemployment, stagnation of economic activity, a little bit of inflation creeping up with the prices of oil rising. Then a second crisis, 78, 79, winter of discontent. So massive disruptions, not only economic, but also social and finally political. That there was a swing from social democratic left consensus to the right. I think, yes, this would be your right. So we see the onset of the conservative revolution. Margaret Thatcher being elected to office, and she rolls back the state, or she promises to roll back the state with a set of policies which we generally discuss under neoliberalism or neoconservatism. Among these policies are or were liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and a monetarist ideal or monetarist doctrine of inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomena. Forget about your Keynesian tools. Focus on your monetary levers and restrict the growth of money supply so that there would be much less inflation in the economy. If you push money, liquidity into markets, into the system, then prices will rise. So we don't want that. That's our chief economic evil, Thatcherites would argue. So let's fight against that. We may have some unemployment, but that'll taper off. Markets will clear and markets will correct themselves. Okay, so that's about it under Thatcherism. Then comes 1990s, New Labour. The pendulum swings back to center-left. New Labour with a new platform for stability. They emphasize public finances, so stable finances. What do we mean by stable finances? What do we mean by state finances? Public finance. Taxes and? So you collect taxes and you Expenditures, very nice. Okay, I'm very glad this morning. So taxes and expenditures, you want to stabilize them. You want to put them on a par, okay? So stable finances, a market reinforcing mechanisms, instruments, policy instruments, and the political basis of support, or basis of political support, is quite untraditional in the sense that New Labour, as we talked about, really addressed business groups or groups around business groups, not only traditional labor or traditional unions, but more widely distributed along both sides of the spectrum. So more pro-business. The idea is endogenous growth theory or new growth theory, where human capital is very important. Ladies and gentlemen, what do we mean by human capital? Human capital. It has something to do with the labor force. That's very good. Education, trainings, experience, very good. So education, training, and experience, all of these make up one's quality of the labor force, make up one's human capital. From the individual's perspective, you invest into your human capital. You develop your skills. You attain higher levels of education, good quality, better quality education, and as you gain experience, you develop human capital. And the new growth theory says not only quantity of labor, but quality of labor matters. Okay, so human capital is very important, and investing into high-tech sectors, and these sectors, from semiconductors to computers, from energy to military equipment. So massive investment into these sectors, where or out of which you expect high economic growth. Okay, so because there will be higher levels of value added produced there, high technology, and you'll be attaining higher levels of economic growth. And this would give Britain an upper hand in the new game of globalization. Okay, so Britain would benefit from surfing the tide of globalization. So that was the program under Platform for Stability and New Labour's program, which once again was in a way, or sometimes referred to as a third way program. Then comes conservative liberal coalition, followed by a conservative coalition, in which we've got a commitment to reduction of the deficit, deficit reduction to stabilize the UK economy, British economy. And there were cuts announced, which were centering on certain programs which had something to do with the welfare state, which included, for example, housing subsidies provided to low-income households, an increase in the age of pensions. For anyone to be eligible to pensions, full pensions, once you retire, you need to complete an age. In the West, this hovers around 65 years of age. In Turkey, it used to be somewhere, 20, 30 years ago, somewhere around 45 for women, 50 for men, has been creeping up, 55 for women, 60 for men, and now we're always discussing whether we should increase this parameter to 65 for women and 65 for men and 60 for women. So if you increase the pensionable age, the pension age in which you'd be eligible for standard full pensions, are you giving more benefits or are you giving less benefits? If you're increasing the age of pensions or pensionable age, less benefits. Okay, so the state in a way would be economizing, would be cutting from those programs. So pension age increased, child benefits, especially for higher income or middle income or middle class families, they've been reduced, and some welfare benefits to be reduced. All of these, the government announced, would be amounting to about 20% of the, savings about 20% of the entire budget, aiming at social services and social aims. So a 20% cut in those. That was the one of the programs in terms of the role of the state for the conservative liberal government. Then comes social policy. So these were basically, we've covered 20th century economic policy, the role of the state in the economy, the role of the British state in the economy. Now let's discuss in a little bit more detail what do we mean by developments in social policy. We see the onset, the emergence of the British welfare state during the war. The plan was there. Lord Beveridge had drafted a plan to introduce a welfare state, a state free of all social ills. That was the plan. It's sometimes referred to as the Beveridge plan or Beveridge report, 1943, at the height of World War II. So when the war was over, you remember that there was common misery and that there was some room, a political window of opportunity for change. Okay? Yes, there was collectivism, but the British ideals of laissez-faire had always been lingering before World War II. But after World War II, given common misery, given poverty, given mass destruction, people believed that they needed a change. And the way to bring about that change had to be through the hands of the state. So instead of the invisible hand of the state, or invisible hand of the market, they chose, as an outcome of the consensus among labor and capital and all sectors, they chose to bring about economic growth through the hands of the state. Okay? So that's what we mean by the consensus era. That's what we mean by the collectivist era or the collectivist consensus. And sometimes this is referred to as the era of embedded liberalism. This is liberalism because the state would intervene at the macro level. It would build the infrastructure, but it wouldn't intervene into micro sectors. So it would make possible an environment conducive for economic growth and social well-being. It's sometimes referred to, as I said, embedded liberalism. It's embedded because that there was a consensus behind it. It was embedded socially as well as politically. Okay, the kind of the welfare state that the British installed or introduced was an extensive welfare state. But this wasn't particularly a generous welfare state. Unlike the welfare states in Scandinavia, up north, and to a certain extent continental European welfare states, the British welfare state is not a particularly generous welfare state. So the benefit programs are there, they're quite developed, but they're not necessarily help individuals make a living out of it. Okay? Yes, they do protect the poor and the needy and those under risk in the labor market, but they're not generous enough for individuals to sustain a good life, a high standard of living. One exception is the National Health Services, which is the healthcare as well as the sickness program, which is based on the principle of universalism. So anyone who is a British citizen, regardless of whether you contribute to the state through Social Security contributions, you're entitled to healthcare or benefits, these kinds of benefits, as well as services. So it's a universal service, and every citizen, every British citizen can benefit from it. The idea is that the welfare state is comprehensive in the sense that it is very much developed. It has all kinds of programs. It was, in a way, a pioneer in the advanced industrialized world in terms of a comprehensive system. So it incorporates all kinds of programs. So there is the program for pensions, unemployment insurance, healthcare, which includes partly sickness, disability, childcare, maternity benefits, housing benefits, social assistance, what have you. So all areas that come under a typical welfare state as we know it now have been provided since the end of World War II. So the British welfare state is about, is it 70 years by now? It's about 70 years old. So it's a comprehensive welfare state. Yes, not necessarily very generous, except for the National Health Services, the healthcare service. So that was the name of the game during the period after World War II. That there was massive state intervention into the economy, but then things changed with Thatcher. But I have a question here.
I did not get why realizing that welfare states should not interfere with markets, because you told that it embraces like most of the services. So what does it mean by not interfering?
Very good question. Not interfere with market or markets, I mean certain sectors in the economy. So micro markets wise, the welfare state does not intervene. It intervenes into providing a balanced economic growth, but not really, for example, really intervening into market for automobiles. Okay, so the state does not really intervene into other markets or separate markets, in goods markets or in services, except for the social services. Okay, so it's mostly macro intervention as opposed to micro intervention. The difference between micro and macro was, remember, we're talking about the state at a state level. You produce goods and services in that state, and the government has all kinds of levers, macroeconomic policy levers, monetary policy, fiscal policy. You try to create an environment conducive for economic growth and social well-being. So that's more like macro intervention. That is macro intervention. Micro intervention is one example is you set prices in the housing market. the British state has always refrained from doing that, or it has been hesitant in setting prices, even during the height of the consensus era. Okay, so it didn't really intervene into separate, distinct markets for goods and services. It was aiming at introducing, sustaining an environment in which you could have sustainable economic growth and decent social services. So that's the distinction between micro markets and macro national economy. Okay, so that starts to change, at least in rhetoric, at least in discourse, from the late 1970s, early 1980s onwards, under the conservative revolution brought about by Margaret Thatcher. Rolling back the state, you need to roll back the state, but you look at public expenditures, and you see that more than half of all your public expenditures are social expenditures. Okay, so more than 50%, 60% of all your public expenditures are your social expenditures that have social goals. These expenditures, these policies have social goals. Attacking unemployment, reducing poverty, reducing inequality. Okay? And so the idea was, or where would you cut back? Well, you don't cut back from military expenditures. You don't cut back from the operation of departments, ministries, operating costs of the state, of the machinery of the state, that is, the bureaucracy. So you think about cutting back from social expenditures. So that was the rhetoric, that was the discourse that's associated with Margaret Thatcher. And she starts speaking about privatizing pensions, privatizing education, privatizing healthcare, privatizing housing services. Okay, so and she does privatize some of these, and the idea was to reduce dependency of individuals on the state. Okay, so that state, like individuals, would be stronger, given the enterprise culture, so that they wouldn't depend on the state. And she brought many changes in the housing program, most of which were quite unpopular. There were many reactions to housing cuts in the British, housing cuts brought about by the British government during the 1980s. And, but when you look at the welfare state, how did the welfare state do, starting from the 1980 till when Margaret Thatcher left office, early 1990s. When you look at the decade, when you look at the trajectories of social expenditures, you don't see much change. I mean, if she said, I'm going to cut back on this program, that program, and the other program, let's say if she promised 10 items to be cut back, she could only cut back 2 or 3. So, or she could only cut back on some of these to a certain extent, but much less in comparison to what she promised or what she said in her day-to-day rhetoric. One reason why this was not possible was the welfare state has been, and it still is, very popular. So any government that says, I'm going to retrench the welfare state, you'll see the death knell of the welfare state. How many votes will you get? Okay? Especially in societies which are gradually aging. If you're, think of a society, an aging society. An aging society needs, I mean, healthcare. Aging society needs pensions. Aging society needs, because of higher risks of unemployment, unemployment benefits. Aging society needs disability programs. Aging society needs housing programs, social assistance programs. Okay? So politically, it becomes a treacherous ballgame. Retrenchment, that is to say, cutbacks on social expenditures, is a treacherous enterprise. It's very difficult to retrench the welfare state politically. Even if you promise that you'll go for cutbacks, it becomes highly problematic, as we saw in the decade under Thatcher. Okay? But still, there was some retrenchment, and the new ideas about rolling back the state, a leaner welfare state, a more flexible welfare state, as opposed to the clumsy, fat, overspending, overly generous welfare state, so-called. So there was a change in rhetoric, change in common, like everyday parlance had changed about when we were talking about the welfare state. Then comes New Labour. New Labour, rejects Thatcherite laissez-faire, Thatcherite rollback. It also rejected traditional labor collectivism. So it tried to adopt a middle ground, a middle way. That is why it is sometimes referred to as the third way. Not the right nor the left, but the third way. Rejects both Thatcherism and traditional labor in modernizing the welfare state. So in modernization of the welfare state, making it leaner, making it more flexible, like Thatcher's ideology, but at the same time, providing benefits to the needy. Okay? So one important element is activation, sometimes referred to as part and parcel of the social investment strategy. What's activation? Or how do you activate? Or whom do you activate? Any ideas? Whom do you activate? In the labor market, whom do you activate? Citizens as prospective labor market participants. In any society, imagine your fathers, your uncles. Are they working or are they not working? They're all working. You guys are about 20 years old. Your mothers and fathers are about, on average 50 years old. Your fathers are working. Your mothers, do all your mothers work? Some of our mothers work. Okay? So if you want to activate prime age males, that is between 25 and 55, policymakers can't do much about them because they're working anyway. The room for maneuvering is when it comes to you guys, the youth, and also your mothers. Okay? So women and youth. And to a certain extent, your grandparents, the elderly. So if you want to activate, if you were the state, if you were the government, you have all kinds of levers, you have incentives and disincentives, you can design all of these. If you want to activate, if you want to target groups, which groups would be these? These groups would not be prime age males, these groups would be the youth, women, and the elderly. And those who are on unemployment benefits, who are unemployed, they don't seek unemployment. They don't seek employment. They're home, and they're not looking for work. So you want to activate all these segments in society. Okay? Especially if you want to reduce dependency on the state, if the elderly start working, let's say your grandfather had retired at the age of 58. So if the government brings him into the system, into the labor force, he'll start producing. Okay, so he'll contribute to the GDP, but his retirement benefits will be less. He'll be taking less out of the pension funds. Let's imagine your mothers. They may have worked before you guys were born. When you were born, they stopped working, and then they couldn't go back to the labor force. So if I'm the government, if I bring your mother back to the labor force, that's also activation. She'll contribute to the GDP, to economic activity, and therefore you will have all higher levels of economic growth. And the youth are on the shoulders of their families and to a certain extent on the shoulders of the state. Youth benefits, okay, youth programs. If you guys start working, then you'll be contributing, but you'll not only be contributing to economic activity, you'll also be off the purse of your families as well as the state. So activation was one of the instruments, one of the strategies employed by the government, which had its roots during Thatcher's era, but this had been much more systematized under New Labour's reign during the late 1990s and early 2000s. So activation is also very important. Incentives to the private sector to hire new labor market entrants. New labor market entrants are, okay? So I, as the state, provide incentives to firms if I tell them, if you hire new labor market entrants, i.e. young people, between the age of 18 and 26 or 25. Especially, I'm going to cut, you won't have to pay your social security contributions, for which you pay me as the state as part and parcel of your of the workers' social security funds. So I tell I tell the firm that, hey, you don't have to pay that extra. I will be paying for that as the state. So you have an incentive to hire young people. Let's say I play with the incentives. I say, as a wage subsidy, I say I pay 50% for males between the age of, like young men, between the age of 18 and 25. If you recruit them, you'll be paying only half of your social security contributions to the state or to the social security institution. But if you recruit a young woman between the age of 18 and 25, you'll pay none. Okay? So the state starts playing with the incentives in a more systematic way. And these policies have been implemented throughout advanced industrialized societies as well as developing ones, including ours in Turkey. So incentives to the private sector to hire new labor market entrants, but also success in healthcare. Not only in outcomes, but also popularity of the government. So popularity of the NHS and education programs. British education programs, British healthcare programs have been hailed during this era, late 1990s, early 2000s, as very successful programs, attaining outcomes and keeping people happy, keeping people healthy, keeping people educated, higher quality labor force, but also these were popular programs among the electorate. Okay, so modernizing the welfare state through these means. Then comes to 2010, conservative liberal democratic coalition. They announced 20% across the board in social spending. They couldn't cut back by 20% by the end of the day, but this was their promise, their electoral pledge. But they said, we won't be cutting back on the NHS, because they knew that the National Health Services was very popular among the electorate. So they said, we're not going to touch that, but they did touch it a little, especially under the current government. So there has been some plans to tinker with the funding of the NHS. So this is how social policies grew in post-World War II Britain. So once again, consensus era, large, comprehensive welfare state, not necessarily very generous, but very systematic, very comprehensive. All the programs exist. Large welfare state. Then conservative revolution, rolling back the state, meant rolling back the welfare state, at least in discourse. So some retrenchment, some cutbacks. A little bit of expansion under Blair's third way, New Labour, then a little bit of contraction under Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, and then followed by the current Conservative governments. So that completes my discussion on social policies in post-World War II Britain. Any questions from here? Anything that looks not clear? Okay, so as you can see, the pendulum swings between right and left in terms of ideologies, collectivism, consensus ideologies versus rolling back the state. Okay, in terms of outcomes, Britain stands as one of the most unequal societies in advanced industrialized countries. It is the most unequal society in the EU. Child poverty rates, as you shall be reading in your book, in your textbook, are still the highest among the advanced industrialized countries. And they're coupled with the US. Despite all kinds of programs in the US, such as No Child Left Behind by George W. Bush and others. So child poverty is still a massive question. One cannot really understand why this is the case, but when you look at the outcomes, these are the problems. Ethnic minorities and women, with respect to ethnic minorities, the incidence of poverty and lower levels of unemployment, lower levels of employment really falls on these groups. Non-European, non-native born groups. Ethnic population is on average younger than white population, which sometimes is associated with the idea of marginalization. So you're young, you're non-native born. In the eyes of society, you are being marginalized. And your numbers are high, much higher than whites, native-born whites. So that really, brings us a social problem. And women, if you're not only young, but also a woman, non-native, then employment opportunities are even much lower or much less. With respect to women, labor force participation among women is very high in Britain. So women participate in the labor force. But when you look at how they participate, they're increasingly working part-time. It looks like a flexible system, but working part-time means good benefits or bad benefits. Bad benefits, no fringe benefits. Okay, Social Security wise, you're not really covered in the system. You're not contributing enough so that you won't be able to retire properly with full eligible pensions. So women work predominantly in the part-time sector. So when you look at the part-time workers, it's mostly women. And also, when you look at the wage gap, gender wage gap, it has been around 12%. It's now come to around 10%. So women earn, in terms of wages, with equal qualifications, 10% less than men. So that tells you something about the value of women in the eyes of British society. New Labour was very much committed to gender equality in the labor market, so they did a lot of policy. They designed and implemented a lot of policies targeting this problem. They also designed family-friendly policies, so maternity benefits, family benefits to support women to play a more active role in the labor market. To a certain extent, the result is that there has been a lower wage gap by about 2 percentage points. So there has been some decline in the wage gap. I think that covers my discussion on political economy. So I think we can take a break now, and then we'll start talking about governance and policy making. Okay.